Eos Prime was not a world, it was a sentence handed down by people in orbit who would never breathe the dust or taste the poison. It was rust and concrete. It was heat that peeled skin from bone and cold that froze breath into knives. It was a place where buildings leaned like drunks, and nothing stood straight for long, not even hope. Mira Holloway was born behind a broken fuel tank and raised in a shipping crate filled with cracked solar cells. She learned to run before she could walk because running kept her alive, and walking made her a target. She scavenged parts from derelict drones and traded them for clean water and data chips. She fixed things, she stitched them together, not because she loved machines, but because they were the only things more broken than she was. The people of Eos Prime did not speak in sentences, they spoke in codes, in warnings and gestures. Their voices were worn thin from the acid rain, and their eyes were always moving, always watching for falling metal, for roving gangs, for the next tremor that might split the colony in half again. The children called the place the Pit, and it was not a name, it was a prophecy. Every year fewer returned from the upper shafts. Every year more were buried beneath slag and silence. And Mira taught them not to cry, because the water lost to tears was water they could drink. She worked in the bones of old machines, repurposing defense drones into security sentries and broken medbots into crude prosthetics. Her clients came in bleeding and left limping, but they left, and that was the point. Survival was victory, beauty was fiction, and trust was suicide. There were rumors of watchers. People said that sometimes late at night, when the wind stopped and the storm blast settled, strange shapes moved through the outer zones, tall and still, with skin like mercury and voices like music heard through metal. And Mira heard the stories and ignored them because belief was a luxury, and fairy tales did not patch airlocks or stop hunger. But the stories would not stop. They grew louder, thicker, whispered through vents, and passed between hands with data slates and smuggled books and drawings etched in soot and oil. Children spoke of lights in the sky and doors in the sand, and sometimes people vanished without blood, without struggle, just gone. Mira saw one of the watchers for the first time when she was pulling copper wire from a collapsed tunnel. It stood at the end of the passage, head bowed, arms long and jointless, eyes glowing not with menace, but with memory, and she felt no fear, only silence, a silence so deep it crushed her heartbeat and filled her mouth with dust. The watcher said nothing, it simply turned and walked into the dark, and Mira did not follow, but she did not forget, and from that moment the colony changed, not with fire or thunder, but with the quiet certainty that they were not alone, and that someone or something had begun to care, even if they did not yet know why. It happened without sound, without warning, without warships or announcements. Just one morning the sky cracked wide open above Eos Prime, and something stepped through. The miners saw at first a shimmer, a bend in the gray that swallowed sunlight and spat out silence. They dropped their tools and stared as the clouds unraveled, and something vast moved behind them, like a curtain pulled by a hand too large to see. Then the watchers came, not falling like meteors, not marching like armies, but drifting like seeds on wind, tall and fluid, their skin not quite silver, not quite alive. They walked through toxic storms without suits. They moved through radiation like it was rain, and they never spoke, not at first. Mira saw one near the heat sink towers. She was loading salvage into a crawler when the air changed and the wind died. And there it was, watching her from the rim of a collapsed dome, its eyes deep and slow, and still. She waited for it to speak or strike, but it only stood like a statue carved from melted stars. The others came more each day, never together, always alone, walking paths. No one saw, no one stopping them, no one daring to get close, but the colony felt it the way animals feel earthquakes before they strike. Something old, something vast had noticed them, and it was not looking away. At first the people feared them. They locked doors that would not stop a breeze. They whispered prayers to old earth gods and traced old military patches like charms against the dark. But the watchers did nothing. They only observed, as if they were trying to remember something they had once lost. Then they began to follow Mira. Not just one, all of them, each in their own way, some from the roofs, some from the shadows, some barely visible at the edge of her sight, always just near enough to feel, not close enough to touch. She asked them nothing, they offered her nothing. Until the smallest of them stepped into her path one evening. Just as the twin moons rose, its frame was narrower, its movements slower. It raised its hand not in threat, but in invitation. And Mira stared at the long fingers and the shimmer of shifting skin, and for reasons she could not name, she followed it. It led her past the ruins of the old water treatment plant, past the radiation fields into the ashlands, where nothing grew and nothing breathed, until they reached a hole in the earth, the wound pulsing with dim red light. The others were already there, standing in a circle around the hole, silent, still waiting. The small one turned to her, and for the first time she heard its voice, not with her ears, but inside her chest, a sound like memory and thunder, and it said only one word: "Come." And Mira took a breath and stepped forward, not because she trusted them, not because she believed, but because deep down beneath every scar and every nightmare, something inside her wanted to know what kind of future waited in a hole that even gods had left behind. The hole was not a hole, it was a mouth, it was a machine, it was a memory. It breathed not with air, but with heat and sound. And Mira felt it before she saw it, a pulse in the soles of her feet, a rhythm like a forgotten song beating through the bones of the planet. She climbed down without a word, the watchers standing above like sentinels, like mourners, like statues, marking the last steps of the living. The shaft spiraled into blackness, but the walls glowed faintly with veins of red and gold, like circuitry etched by ancient hands, or maybe not hands at all. The air changed as she descended, thick with pressure and vibration, like she was falling through the throat of something alive. It was not a mine, it was not a shelter, it was something else, something older than names and larger than fear. At the bottom she found the forge. It did not look like a machine, and it did not look like nature. It looked like both. It looked like something that had grown and been built, and then grown again. Its surface writhed softly with patterns that changed when she blinked, like it was dreaming her into being. The floor around it was littered with relics, bones, twisted metal fragments of languages burned into stone. The watchers circled the forge without touching it, their heads bowed, their limbs folded inward, like they were praying or mourning or remembering. Mira stepped closer, and the forge responded not with words but with warmth. It opened not physically but mentally, a flood of impressions and visions that poured into her mind like molten data, images of other worlds dead and dreaming, of ships burning in the void, of voices screaming in languages she could almost understand. And beneath it all she saw herself, or someone like her, walking through ruins, holding fire in her hands, a creature made not to rule or destroy, but to change, to adapt, to break, and be rebuilt again and again, until nothing could stop her, because nothing could survive what she had already endured. The watchers did not speak, but their silence grew heavier, like pressure before a storm. The small one reached out again and touched the forge, and in that instant Mira saw it all. She saw the birth of the forge on a world that no longer existed. She saw the Centauri as they once were, proud and curious and unbroken. She saw the war that shattered them, and the choice they made to bury the forge where no one would find it until someone worthy stood before it again. The forge was a test and a gift and a mirror. It did not choose heroes, it revealed what already was. Mira reached out, and the surface rippled beneath her fingers, warm and cold, alive and waiting. And she knew she had not been brought here by accident. She had not been followed because she was special. She had been followed because she was broken. And the forge had been waiting for something broken enough to understand what it meant to rebuild from nothing. The moment Mira touched the forge, the world stopped, not in silence, not in stillness, but in pause, like the breath between lightning and thunder, like the final heartbeat before change. The heat surged through her, not burning, not soothing, but reshaping something inside her that had never healed, something she had hidden beneath scars and stubbornness. She fell, but not downward. She fell inward through layers of her self-memories, regrets, choices replaying in endless loops. Her father's coughing in the storm tent, her sister's fingers frozen in the snow the moment she learned how to sew flesh back onto bone with scrap wire and fire. She lived it all again, not as punishment, but as proof. The forge did not speak in words, it spoke in images, in instinct, in evolution. It showed her what she had become, and what she could be, and what she might unleash if she chose wrong. And it did not lie. It showed the blood, it showed the fire, it showed the ruins. It also showed her rising. Not glowing, not perfect, but standing again, and again, and again, through storm and war, and betrayal standing when others fell, standing when hope was a joke, standing because quitting never felt right. The Forge welcomed that part of her, not the cleverness, not the kindness, not even the courage. It welcomed the part that refused to break, no matter how many pieces she was in, the part that kept crawling when walking was gone, that kept laughing when her teeth were broken. Mira screamed once, not in pain, but in clarity. She saw herself reflected in the machine, not as she wished to be, but as she was, brutal, determined, ugly, and human, and it was enough. The Forge accepted her not as a savior, but as a mirror, a matching frequency. The transformation began not in body, but in thought. She felt her mind stretch, widen, bloom. She understood systems, languages, designs buried for 1,000,000 years. She could feel gravity like a shape. She could taste radiation like a spice. Her hands itched for tools. Her heart ached with purpose. She opened her eyes and saw the Watchers kneeling, their heads to the ground, their bodies trembling, not in fear but reverence. Mira stood, light dripping from her skin like oil. The Forge now silent behind her, but not dead, never dead, just sleeping again, waiting again. And she knew what it had given her, not power, not command, not a crown. It had given her the truth, that the galaxy did not need heroes, it needed survivors who could build again and again and again, that perfection was useless and beauty was brittle, and that the only thing stronger than creation was someone who had already survived the end of the world. She was not chosen, she was earned, and now the Forge lived in her, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what humanity truly was, beneath the scars, beneath the myths, beneath the ugliness. Limitless. Mira did not return the way she came, she rose. The path that led down into the Forge no longer existed, not because it had collapsed, but because it had never been real, not in the way maps understood. She emerged in the ashfields 20 kilometers from where she entered, with no wound, no mark, just the hum of something ancient curling beneath her skin. The air felt thinner, like it made way for her, and the Watchers followed her silently, scattered across the ridges like a funeral procession, waiting to see what she would do with the burden she had taken. The colony did not recognize her at first. She looked the same, her face, the same scars, her eyes, the same color, but people stepped back anyway, because there was something in the way she moved, in the way she stood, like she had stopped needing permission to exist. They asked no questions because they already knew. They had seen the lights, felt the tremors. They had watched the Watchers move like shadows drawn toward a center of gravity that now wore a human face. Mira did not give speeches. She did not call for loyalty or obedience. She began to build. She called for steel, for parts, for coolant lines, and shattered drones, and old reactor cores, and people brought them, not because she demanded, but because she inspired, and because something had shifted in the air, something had cracked in the foundation of fear that held Eos Prime hostage. The Watchers helped not with tools, but with guidance. They moved things Mira could not touch. They made room. They held back the dying storms that used to tear metal from bone. And when the winds cleared, the first frame of the beacon stood on the ridge, its bones humming with energy, pulled from the Forge itself. It was not a weapon, and it was not a temple. It was a signal, a message broadcast through dimensions, not of distance, but of resonance, and it said one thing over and over: we are still here. That was when the others came, not the Watchers, but the ones who made them. The architects. Not Centauri, not human, not fully real in the way gravity was real. Their ships were shapes of concept and color. They spoke through translation engines older than suns, and when they arrived they offered Mira a choice: surrender the Forge, walk away, become silent again, or face the consequences of her refusal. She laughed once, short and hard, and told them to try. They did. They sent vessels not to bomb, but to erase, to unwind matter with thought, to overwrite entire histories with vibration. They wanted to unmake the signal before it spread, before others heard, before others began to believe. But they were too late. Because Mira had not built a monument, she had built a mirror. The beacon reflected not light but defiance. Every blast from the architects fed it, every attempt to silence it made it louder, and when it finally pulsed back with full force, it sent a wave of understanding across stars and minds, and species who had never heard of Eos Prime suddenly wept without knowing why. The Forge did not make Mira stronger, it made her visible, it amplified what was already there. Humanity was never meant to conquer, and never meant to serve. It was meant to adapt, to outlast, to echo. The war did not end in fire or surrender, it ended in silence, as the architects pulled away, not beaten, not destroyed, simply unwilling to face what they had awakened, because they remembered this feeling from long ago, when their own kind looked into the forge and saw themselves and fled. Mira stood at the center of the beacon, the ashes still falling around her, and she said nothing because she didn't need to. The galaxy already knew, and it would never forget. They came not in waves, but in signals, broken pulses through forgotten networks, fractured beacons, blinking from dead satellites, voices cracked by time but still speaking. And Mira heard them all, not with her ears, but in her chest where the forge had left its fire. Across the galaxy, people had felt the echo, refugees from collapsed moons, soldiers hiding on Outlaw stations, orphans, raised by ghosts of machines. All of them heard the signal, and all of them recognized the frequency, because it was not hope, and it was not power, it was pain. It was survival. What Mira built on Eos Prime was not beautiful, it was not clean or polished or elegant. It was jagged, rusted, welded from broken things and haunted by loss. But it was alive, and it worked, and it spread like roots through concrete. Ships came, old freighters patched with scrap, drifting into orbit, not to invade, but to join. They carried survivors of dead colonies, forgotten species, fringe engineers, outlaw doctors, anyone who had nowhere left to run. And Mira welcomed them, not with laws or flags, but with tools and work and silence. The Centauri watched it all from the edges, never interfering, never leading, because they understood now the forge had not chosen Mira, because she was human, it had chosen humanity, because it saw what lay beneath the fear, beneath the mess, beneath the blood. Resilience. Mira did not speak to the new arrivals. She worked, she carried parts, she repaired broken ships with her bare hands, she bled on the scaffolds, and stood beside the tired, the sick, the scared. And they followed her, not because she asked, but because she never told them to. The architects had vanished into the deep, but their silence was not peace, it was warning. And Mira knew it. They would return, or something worse would. And when they did, they would not bring weapons, they would bring doubts, they would try to rot the movement from inside. So she built the crucibles. Not factories, not fortresses. They were places of trial, not for others, but for the self-rooms where people walked in and faced their own truths, where they screamed and wept and broke, and came out carrying fire of their own, not like Mira, not copies, but echoes, each one human, each one necessary. And slowly the idea began to spread. That it was not about Mira, it was not about Eos Prime, it was about the ones who stayed when things were ugly, the ones who never ran, the ones who crawled through pain and came out with dirt in their teeth and fire in their bones. A child born under the beacon grew up believing that strength meant standing for those who could not. A mechanic from a prison moon rebuilt her planet's core and named it Holloway. A war orphan with no name walked into a forge and came out carrying a song that woke the dead. They were not soldiers. They were not chosen. They were not perfect. But they were loud. Loud enough to shake systems. Loud enough to challenge order. Loud enough to be heard. And what lay beneath the stars was not peace, and not war, it was choice, and the cost of that choice was everything. Mira stood in the same place where she had first seen the Watcher, where her journey began, and she looked up at the sky, not to dream, not to wish, but to promise. When they come again, we will be ready. When they try to silence us, we will be louder. When they forget who we are, we will remind them. The sky above Eos Prime was no longer gray, it burned with color, not from flame or warships, but from vessels arriving without weapons, without fear. The stars themselves seemed to bend around the colony now, not in reverence, but in recognition, because the forgotten world had become a beacon not of power but of proof. Proof that survival was sacred. Proof that ugliness could be a beginning. Proof that the broken could build. Mira walked through the central district without guards, without titles, without armor. Her body carried the weight of years, the ache of sleepless nights, the tension of things still to come, but her eyes held clarity, and her hands were steady. She did not walk like a queen or a savior. She walked like someone who had earned every scar. Children followed her not because they were told to, but because their parents had told them stories of the woman who lived through the storms, who went down into the ground and came back with fire in her chest and truth in her hands. The crucibles had grown beyond Eo's prime, now scattered across systems, built into asteroid hollows, abandoned war stations, floating ruins, and each one pulsed with the same energy. Each one turned the broken into builders, the lost into leaders, not through doctrine, but through endurance, through blood and breath and belief. And still Mira refused to speak to crowds. Still she worked with her hands. Still she slept in a reinforced crate near the scrapyards, because power had never interested her. Only purpose, only people, only momentum. It was Jonas who told her first. The signal had reached the core worlds, not the edges, not the exiles, but the empires, the architects of silence and control and fear. And now those in power were afraid not of armies, but of ideas, because no fortress can withstand the weight of 1,000,000 voices rising at once. Mira listened and nodded and kept building. It was Sarah who came to her after the last crucible opened on a moon, once burned flat by orbital bombardment, a young woman who had grown up hearing only screaming, now singing into a transmitter that reached places Mira had never seen, and in her voice, the forge lived again, soft, fierce, unstoppable. It was Io herself, the first child born beneath the beacon, who asked Mira if she had ever wanted to leave, to go back to the stars, to be something more than this. And Mira had smiled and said no, because she already had everything she ever needed. She had a people who refused to die. She had a home made of rust and fire and truth. She had a future that no one could silence again. And she had stayed. When no one believed, when nothing grew, when the only thing left to hold on to was grit and grief and gut, she had stayed. So now she could give everything. Not because she was chosen, not because she was better, but because she was still here. And in the deepest part of the forge, in a place even she had never touched, something ancient smiled, something vast, and watching and waiting, and it whispered through circuits and stone and fought. You stayed when I was ugly. Now you are ready for what lies beneath. Now you are ready to rise. And Mira Holloway, the woman who had once stitched torn flesh with wire and hope, looked into the sky, not to leave but to light it. Because this was not the end. This was the beginning. And now the galaxy would never be quiet again.